November 23, 1944. The announcement came during evening roll call at the remote prisoner of war camp outside Fort Stockton, Texas, and it made no sense whatsoever. Colonel William Hartley stood before the assembled German women prisoners, his weathered face serious beneath his campaign hat. The desert wind whipped around the compound as 47 women in faded gray auxiliary uniforms waited in formation. They had learned to expect the unexpected in this strange American facility that felt more like a working ranch than a prison camp, but nothing had prepared them for what the colonel was about to say. "Ladies," he began, his interpreter translating his words into German. "Tomorrow is Thanksgiving Day, an important American holiday. My staff and I would like to invite you to join us for a traditional Thanksgiving feast." The words hung in the cooling desert air like an impossible dream. Several women glanced at each other with confusion and suspicion. Greta Schiller, a 24-year-old former postal worker from Munich, felt her heart begin to race. She understood enough English to know she had heard correctly, but understanding the words and believing them were entirely different matters. Captain Ilse Braun, the highest-ranking woman among the prisoners, stood rigid with barely concealed outrage. Her voice cut through the silence in sharp German. "This is a test. They want to see which of us will fraternize with the enemy. We must refuse." But Greta noticed something the Capitan had missed. She saw the way the American guards stood relaxed but respectful, the way Colonel Hartley's eyes showed genuine invitation rather than mockery. She had been in this camp for 3 months, and nothing about these peculiar American cowboys who served as their guards had matched what she had been taught to expect. Sergeant James Callahan, whom everyone called Buck, stepped forward. He was a tall Texan, with sun-darkened skin and the easy confidence of a man who had spent more time on horseback than in military formation. "Colonel," he said in his slow drawl, "maybe the ladies need some time to think on it. Big decision and all." Colonel Hartley nodded. "You have until tomorrow morning to decide. Anyone who wishes to join us will be welcome. Anyone who prefers to remain in quarters will not be judged or punished. This is an invitation, not an order." As the women were dismissed, they walked back to their barracks in small groups, speaking in urgent whispers. Greta found herself walking alone, her mind churning with questions. She had been captured 5 months earlier outside Paris, serving as a communications specialist for the Wehrmacht. She had expected harsh treatment, perhaps even violence. Instead, she had found herself in West Texas, surrounded by Americans who seemed more interested in teaching her how to ride a horse than in punishing her for her country's sins. Tomorrow was Thanksgiving. The Cowboys had invited them to feast, and Greta Schiller had no idea whether accepting would be an act of treason or an act of survival. The story begins 3 months earlier, in August 1944, when Greta Schiller first stepped off the transport truck into what felt like another planet. The heat hit her like a physical blow. Having grown up in Munich with its cool forests and mountain breezes, she had never experienced anything like the merciless Texas sun. The landscape stretched endlessly in every direction, dotted with scrub brush and rocky outcroppings that shimmered in waves of heat. This was supposed to be a prison camp, but it looked more like the frontier photographs she had seen in her school geography books. Greta and 26 other German women auxiliaries stood in an uncertain cluster, their gray uniforms already darkening with sweat. They had been captured during the chaotic retreat from France, processed through England, then shipped across the Atlantic to America. Each step of the journey had taken them further from everything they knew. A tall American officer approached, and Greta instinctively straightened. But instead of the harsh commands she expected, he removed his hat in a gesture that seemed almost courteous. "Welcome to Fort Stockton," he said through an interpreter. "I'm Colonel Hartley. This facility was a working cattle ranch before the war, and it still is in many ways. You'll be housed in the converted bunkhouses, and you'll be expected to work, but you'll be treated according to the Geneva Convention." The women were led past corrals where horses watched them with mild curiosity. American soldiers in uniforms that seemed strangely casual moved about their duties. Several wore cowboy hats instead of standard military caps. One was repairing a fence with the easy competence of someone who had done it 1,000 times before. Greta's barracks was a long wooden building that smelled of pine and dust. Each woman was assigned a narrow bed, with clean sheets, a footlocker, and a small window that looked out over the desert. It was sparse, but surprisingly clean. Nothing like the horror stories they had been told about American prison camps. That first evening, as the women gathered uncertainly in their new quarters, they heard music drifting from somewhere outside. Not military marches, but something else. Something with guitars and a mournful quality that spoke of loneliness and wide-open spaces. Greta moved to her window and looked out. Several American guards sat around a small fire, one playing a guitar while others listened. They looked young, tired, and as far from home as she was. One of them caught her watching and, instead of shouting at her to get away from the window, simply nodded in greeting before returning his attention to the music. "They're not what we were told," whispered Anna Weber, a nurse from Hamburg, who had been assigned the bunk next to Greta's. "They're just boys. Farm boys and cowboys." Greta pressed her forehead against the warm glass and watched the fire flicker in the gathering darkness. She had expected enemies. She had found something far more confusing. She had found people. September brought slightly cooler temperatures and the beginning of something unexpected. Sergeant James Callahan, the rangy Texan everyone called Buck, was assigned to oversee the prisoners' work details. Unlike the other guards who maintained professional distance, Buck seemed to view the German women as a puzzle to be solved rather than enemies to be contained. Greta first spoke to him during her second week at the camp. She had been assigned to help sort supplies in the quartermaster's shed when Buck appeared in the doorway, backlit by the harsh morning sun. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Colonel says you speak some English. That true?" Greta nodded cautiously. "I study in school. Not so good, but some." Buck's weathered face creased into what might have been approval. "Well, that's more than most folks around here speak German. How'd you feel about helping translate when needed? Make things easier for everybody?" It was phrased as a question, not an order. That small courtesy caught Greta off guard. In the Wehrmacht, no one had asked how she felt about anything. "I can try," she managed. Over the following weeks, Greta found herself serving as an informal bridge between the German prisoners and their American captors. Buck would explain work assignments, camp rules, or practical matters, and she would translate for the other women. But something else began to happen during these exchanges. Buck started teaching her things that had nothing to do with prison camp regulations. "See that plant there?" he said one afternoon, pointing to a stubby green growth near the fence line. "That's prickly pear cactus. Looks mean, but if you know how to handle it, you can eat the fruit. Desert's full of things like that. Looks hostile till you understand it." Greta wondered if he was talking about more than just plants. She studied the cactus, its fierce spines protecting something potentially nourishing underneath. The metaphor was not lost on her. Buck taught her cowboy wisdom in his slow, patient drawl. How to read the sky for coming weather, which snakes to avoid and which were harmless. How a good horse could sense a person's character better than most people could. These lessons felt subversive somehow, as if learning to survive in this desert landscape was a kind of betrayal of her German identity. "Why do you teach me these things?" she asked him one day, her English improving with practice. Buck considered the question while rolling a cigarette with practiced fingers. "My daddy always said that knowledge is the one thing nobody can take from you. War won't last forever, Miss Schiller. Might as well learn something useful while you're here." It was the first time anyone had suggested she might have a future beyond the war. The possibility opened, inside her like those desert flowers Buck had shown her, the ones that bloomed after rain in the most unlikely places. October arrived with cooler mornings and a shift in the camp's rhythm. The ranch portion of the facility needed harvesting, and Colonel Hartley made a decision that shocked his staff. He assigned the German women prisoners to work alongside American personnel in bringing in the crops. The announcement caused immediate controversy among the guards. Several argued that it violated security protocols. Others worried about what Washington would say if word got out that enemy prisoners were working side by side with American soldiers. But the colonel remained firm. "We need the hands," he said simply, And idle prisoners are unhappy prisoners. Put them to work. Greta found herself assigned to a crew harvesting cotton in the eastern fields. She had never picked cotton before, had never done any kind of agricultural labor. Her hands, accustomed to sorting mail and operating telegraph equipment, were soft and unprepared for the rough bowls that left her fingers raw and bleeding by the end of the first day. Buck noticed her struggling. Without a word, he produced a pair of worn work gloves from his saddlebag. "These were my sister's," he said. "She's got hands about your size. You'll need them, or you'll tear yourself up." Greta accepted the gloves with trembling fingers. Such a small gesture, but it carried weight beyond its simplicity. These Americans kept showing her kindness when she had been taught to expect only cruelty. It was destabilizing, undermining everything she thought she understood about the war and her place in it. The work was grueling. The sun beat down mercilessly as the women moved through the rows, filling canvas bags that grew heavier with each handful of cotton. But something unexpected happened during those long days in the fields. The rigid separation between prisoner and captor began to soften. When Anna Weber collapsed from heat, exhaustion, it was an American private who carried her to the shade and brought her water. When a wagon wheel broke, German and American hands worked together to repair it. During water breaks, conversations started to happen. Hesitant at first, conducted through Greta's improving translation skills. An American soldier from Nebraska talked about his family's farm. A German woman from Bavaria described her father's apple orchard. They discovered they knew the same songs about harvest time, sung in different languages, but carrying the same melody of gratitude for the earth's provision. Mrs. Eleanor Martinez, the elderly cook who managed the camp kitchen, sometimes brought lunch to the fields. She was a tiny woman with weathered brown skin and eyes that seemed to see through pretense. She treated everyone the same, prisoner and guard alike, ladling out stew and cornbread with the same generous hand. One afternoon, as Greta sat exhausted in the wagon bed heading back to camp, she looked at her dirt-stained hands and realized something profound had shifted. For the first time since her capture, she felt useful. Not as a soldier or a prisoner, but as a human being contributing something of value. The harvest had given her back a piece of her dignity. Mid-November brought the first real cold snap to West Texas, and with it, an idea that would divide the camp staff more deeply than any tactical decision Colonel Hartley had made since taking command. It started in the kitchen where Mrs. Eleanor Martinez was inventory checking supplies for the upcoming holiday. The old cook had been working at the ranch long before it became a prison camp, and she had strong opinions about how things should be done. When Colonel Hartley stopped by for his morning coffee, she ambushed him with a question that had clearly been brewing for some time. "Colonel, what are you planning to do about Thanksgiving for those girls?" She gestured vaguely toward the barracks where the German women were housed. Her tone suggested she already knew the answer and didn't approve of it. Hartley paused mid-sip. "The prisoners will receive a standard holiday meal in their quarters, Mrs. Martinez. That's regulation." "Regulation," she snorted, wiping her hands on her apron with sharp, irritated movements. "You know what my grandfather used to say? He came to Texas when it was still Mexico, and he said you measure a people by how they treat strangers at their table. Even strangers who were enemies yesterday." The colonel set down his cup carefully. "Mrs. Martinez, these aren't just strangers, they're prisoners of war, enemy nationals. There are rules about fraternization. Rules." She fixed him with a stare that had cowed ranch hands twice her size. "Those girls have been working our harvest. They've been respectful and hardworking. Thanksgiving is about gratitude and breaking bread together. You want to teach them what America stands for? Don't lecture them. Show them." That afternoon, Hartley called a staff meeting to discuss the idea. The response was immediate and divided. Major Dennis Chen, the camp's executive officer, was firmly opposed. "Sir, this sets a dangerous precedent. Washington will have our heads if word gets out that we're hosting social events with enemy prisoners." But Buck Callahan leaned back in his chair with a thoughtful expression. "Colonel, I've been working with these women every day for 3 months. They're not fanatics, Most of them are just scared kids who got caught up in something bigger than they understood. Mrs. Martinez might be onto something. Lieutenant Sarah Morrison, one of the few female officers at the camp, spoke up carefully. If we do this, sir, it needs to be their choice. No pressure, no consequences for refusing, a genuine invitation. The debate continued for 2 hours. Security concerns were weighed against humanitarian considerations. Regulations were consulted. Precedents were examined. Finally, Colonel Hartley made his decision. We'll extend the invitation. Make it clear that attendance is voluntary and that no one will be punished or rewarded based on their choice. Mrs. Martinez, you'll have your Thanksgiving feast. God help us all if this goes sideways. Buck was given the task of quietly gauging the prisoner's potential response. That evening, he mentioned the possibility to Greta during their regular translation session. Her reaction told him everything he needed to know. Her eyes widened with something between hope and terror. They would really do this? She whispered. Invite us to their table? Would you come if they did? Buck asked. Greta's silence was answer enough. The question wasn't whether she wanted to come. The question was whether she dared to. The official invitation was announced at evening roll call on November 23rd, and it detonated like a grenade in the quiet routine of camp life. Within minutes of dismissal, the German women's barracks erupted into heated debate that continued long into the night. Captain Ilse Braun was unequivocal in her position. She stood in the center of the barracks, her bearing still military despite months of captivity, her voice sharp with authority. This is a trap. The Americans want to identify the weak among us, those willing to betray their homeland for a good meal. Anyone who accepts this invitation shames herself and dishonors Germany. Several women nodded in agreement, particularly the older prisoners who had been more deeply indoctrinated in Reich ideology. But others were less certain. Anna Weber, the nurse from Hamburg, spoke up hesitantly. What if it's genuine? These Americans have treated us fairly. Better than fairly, if we're honest. That's exactly their strategy, Braun snapped back. They soften you with kindness, so you'll forget who you are. They want to break your spirit. Greta sat on her bunk, listening to the arguments swirl around her. Her hands still bore the calluses from weeks of harvest work. She thought about Buck's patient teaching, Mrs. Martinez's equal portions of stew, Colonel Hartley's consistent fairness. Were those calculated manipulations or simple human decency? She honestly didn't know anymore. What do you think? Whispered Marguerite Hoffman, a young woman from Berlin who slept in the bunk above Greta's. Will you go? I don't know, Greta admitted. Part of me wants to. Part of me is terrified of what it might mean. The debate continued for 3 days. The camp became divided between those who would attend, those who would refuse, and those still agonizing over the decision. Buck noticed the tension immediately. He approached Greta during her morning work assignment with characteristic directness. Your friends seem pretty wound up about this dinner invitation. Greta struggled to find the English words for her conflicted feelings. It is difficult. To accept feels like betrayal, but to refuse feels like... She paused, searching, like refusing to see truth. What truth is that? Buck asked, genuinely curious. That maybe enemies can sit at same table. That maybe war does not change everything about who we are as people. Her English was improving rapidly, shaped by necessity and these daily conversations. Buck nodded slowly. My granddaddy fought in the Spanish-American War. Hated the Spanish with a passion during those years. After the war ended, he ended up working on a ranch owned by a man from Cuba. Became best friends. He used to say that war makes us into things we're not, and peace gives us the chance to remember who we really are. Meanwhile, the American staff had their own concerns. In the enlisted men's barracks, several guards expressed discomfort with the entire arrangement. We're supposed to be watching them, not breaking bread with them, complained Private Davis. But others, particularly those who had worked alongside the German women during harvest, felt differently. Mrs. Martinez ignored all the S's, controversy, and focused on practical matters. She requisitioned additional turkeys, commandeered every able body in the kitchen, and began preparations for a feast that would either become a symbol of reconciliation or a spectacular failure of judgment. Either way, she intended to serve a meal worthy of the occasion. Thanksgiving morning dawned cold and clear over West Texas. Greta woke before sunrise, her stomach twisted in knots of anticipation and dread. Around her, other women stirred restlessly. The moment of decision had arrived. By breakfast time, the division was clear. Capitan Braun and 19 other women announced they would remain in quarters. Viewing the invitation as a test of loyalty, they refused to fail. But 27 women, including Greta, Anna, and Marguerite, made the choice to attend. They dressed in their cleanest uniforms, brushed their hair with unusual care, and tried to ignore the accusing stares from those who had chosen differently. The mess hall had been transformed. Mrs. Martinez and her kitchen crew had worked through the night, and the result was remarkable. Long tables were arranged in rows, covered with white cloths that had been stored away for special occasions. Fall decorations made from dried corn stalks and colorful leaves created an atmosphere that felt celebratory rather than institutional. The smell of roasting turkey filled the air, mixed with unfamiliar spices that made Greta's mouth water despite her nervousness. The American staff began arriving around noon. Colonel Hartley came first, dressed in his formal uniform. Buck appeared shortly after, looking uncomfortable in a pressed shirt and tie instead of his usual work clothes. Lieutenant Morrison shepherded the German women in, her manner gentle but professional, making it clear this was a genuine invitation, not a command performance. The seating arrangement had been carefully considered. Rather than separating prisoners from guards, the tables mixed everyone together. Greta found herself seated between Buck and a young private named Tommy Henderson from Oklahoma. Across from her sat Mrs. Martinez herself, and beside the cook was Anna Weber, whose nervous hands kept smoothing the tablecloth. Colonel Hartley stood to address the gathering. His words were translated by Greta in a voice that trembled slightly. "Today we give thanks for many things. For the food before us, for the end of war drawing closer, and for the reminder that even in difficult times, we can choose to see each other's humanity. Welcome to our table." The meal began in awkward silence. Platters were passed with careful politeness. Turkey, stuffing, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, sweet potato casserole, green beans, and cornbread moved from hand to hand. The German women stared at dishes they had never seen before, unsure of what to take or how to eat it. Mrs. Martinez noticed their hesitation. With her characteristic directness, she began explaining each dish in Spanish-accented English while Greta translated. "This is stuffing, made with bread and herbs. This red sauce is made from cranberries, very American, a little sweet, a little sour. You put it with the turkey. Try everything. If you don't like it, you don't have to finish it, but you should try." Something about her practical warmth broke the ice. Tommy Henderson started telling a story about his first Thanksgiving away from home, serving at a training camp in Georgia. His tale of accidentally dumping an entire gravy boat into his lap had people smiling, then quietly laughing. Buck shared a story about Thanksgivings on the ranch before the war, when his sister would burn the rolls every single year but refused to admit they were anything less than perfect. Gradually, conversation began to flow more naturally. Anna Weber, speaking through Greta's translation, described German Christmas traditions that sounded similar to American ones. An American corporal asked about German harvest festivals. The questions were tentative but genuine, born from curiosity rather than interrogation. The weeks following Thanksgiving brought changes to the camp that no one could have predicted. The feast had lasted 4 hours, ending with pumpkin pie that the German women approached with suspicion before discovering its unexpected sweetness. When they finally returned to their barracks that evening, they found Capitan Braun and the others who had refused to attend waiting in stony silence. The division within the German prisoners deepened. Those who had attended the feast were labeled collaborators by Braun and her supporters. Morning roll calls became tense affairs, with the two groups deliberately standing apart. Greta found herself caught in the middle, trying to maintain peace while defending her decision to accept the invitation. "You betrayed everything we stand for," Braun said to her one morning, her voice cold with contempt. "You sat at the enemy's table and smiled while our homeland burns." Greta met her gaze steadily, surprised by her own calm. "I sat at a table with people who treated me with dignity. If that's betrayal, then perhaps I don't understand loyalty the way I thought I did." But the consequences of the feast extended beyond internal camp politics. Buck noticed that the women who had attended now worked with different energy. They volunteered for tasks without being asked. They helped maintain the barracks with newfound purpose. Anna Weber began assisting in the camp infirmary without prompting, her nursing skills becoming invaluable to the overworked medical staff. Greta's role as translator expanded naturally. She found herself involved in daily camp operations, bridging not just language, but understanding between the two groups. Colonel Hartley began consulting her on matters related to prisoner morale and welfare. It was an unprecedented level of trust to place in an enemy prisoner, and Greta felt the weight of that responsibility. Then, on a gray December morning, the mail truck arrived with letters from Europe. The Red Cross had finally processed communications through proper channels, and several prisoners received news from home for the first time in months. Greta's name was called. Her hands shook as she accepted the thin envelope with its German stamps and censorship marks. She waited until evening to open it, sitting alone on her bunk while others slept. The letter was from her aunt in Stuttgart, dated 2 months earlier. The handwriting was shaky, the words carefully chosen to pass censorship, but the message was clear enough. Greta's mother had been killed in an Allied bombing raid in July. Her younger brother Friedrich was missing, last seen during the defense of Berlin. Their apartment building no longer existed. The page blurred as tears filled her eyes. She had known intellectually that Germany was being destroyed, had read the reports in American newspapers. But this made it personal, made it real. Her mother was gone. Her brother was probably dead. The home she had fought to defend no longer existed except in memory. Anna found her sitting there in the darkness, the letter clutched in her hands. Without a word, the nurse sat beside her and wrapped an arm around Greta's shoulders. They had been strangers 6 months ago, fellow prisoners brought together by circumstance. Now Anna's presence was the only comfort available in a world that had become unrecognizable. "What do I go back to?" Greta whispered. "Even if the war ends tomorrow, what is there to return to?" Anna had no answer. She had received her own letter with similar news. Hamburg had been devastated by firestorms. Her family's neighborhood was gone. They sat together in the darkness, 2 young women mourning a homeland that no longer existed. Winter settled over West Texas with surprising cold. The German women wrapped themselves in army-issue blankets and watched snow dust the desert landscape in a thin white veil that melted by mid-morning. But the cold outside was nothing compared to the chill that had settled into their hearts as more letters arrived from Europe. By January 1945, nearly every woman in the camp had received some kind of news from home. Almost all of it was devastating. Cities destroyed, family members dead or missing. The Germany they remembered was being systematically erased by the advancing Allied armies and years of total war. Greta found herself counseling other women through their grief, even as she struggled with her own. Her role as translator had evolved into something closer to mediator and confidant. Women came to her with their letters, asking her to help them understand the careful language their relatives used to describe horrors too large for direct words. The dynamics with Capitan Braun's group shifted unexpectedly. As more women received terrible news, the rigid certainty that had sustained them began to crack. One evening, Braun herself approached Greta in the barracks. The older woman's face looked haggard, aged beyond her 38 years. "My husband was killed at Stalingrad," she said quietly, all her military bearing gone. "They just now told me. 2 years I didn't know. 2 years I kept believing he was coming home." Greta didn't know what to say. Braun had been her harshest critic, the voice of unwavering loyalty to a cause that was crumbling into dust. Now she stood before Greta, like any other grieving woman, stripped of ideology by personal loss. The camp itself was changing too. Colonel Hartley received orders that German prisoners across America would begin repatriation procedures as soon as the war in Europe ended. The news should have brought relief, but instead it created anxiety. What were they returning to? Who would be waiting for them? Buck noticed Greta's increasing melancholy during their work sessions. One afternoon, he asked her directly what she was thinking about. She struggled to express it, in English, but finally managed. "I think about going back to a place that is not home anymore, to people who will see me as failure because I was captured, to country that became something I do not recognize." "What if you didn't go back?" Buck asked carefully. The question hung between them like something dangerous. "What do you mean?" "War's gonna end eventually. America takes in refugees, people who got nowhere else to go. Just wondering if you'd ever consider staying." It was the first time anyone had spoken aloud the thought that had been growing in Greta's mind for weeks. Stay in America. Start over in a place where her past didn't define her future. Where she could be someone other than a defeated enemy soldier. "Is that even possible?" she whispered. Buck shrugged. "Don't know. But I've learned that lots of impossible things turn out to be possible if folks want them bad enough." That night, Greta lay awake thinking about home and what that word really meant anymore. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The war that had consumed the world for 6 years was finally over. At the Fort Stockton camp, the news arrived via radio broadcast, and the reaction was complicated. American staff celebrated cautiously, aware that their prisoners were receiving news of their homeland's total defeat. Colonel Hartley gathered everyone in the mess hall, the same space where Thanksgiving dinner had been served 6 months earlier. He announced that repatriation procedures would begin within weeks. Ships were being prepared to transport German prisoners back to Europe. The women would be processed through displaced persons camps before being released to whatever remained of their former lives. Greta sat listening to the announcement, her mind curiously calm. She had made her decision weeks ago, though she hadn't yet spoken it aloud. When the colonel asked if anyone had questions, she stood slowly. "Colonel Hartley, is it possible for prisoner to request to stay in America?" Her English was nearly fluent now, shaped by months of daily use. "Not as prisoner, but as immigrant or refugee?" The room fell silent. Every eye turned toward her. Capitan Braun's face showed shock and betrayal. But Anna Weber stood up beside Greta, then Marguerite, then 3 other women. They formed a small group of 6 who had arrived at the same impossible conclusion. Buck caught Greta's eye from across the room. His slight nod told her he had expected this, perhaps had even hoped for it. The process was complicated and unprecedented. The War Department had procedures for repatriation, but none for enemy prisoners requesting asylum. Letters were written to Washington. Inquiries were made through proper channels. Local sponsors were needed, employment secured, character references provided. Mrs. Martinez immediately volunteered to sponsor Anna, who wanted to continue her nursing training. The Henderson family, who had been bringing supplies to the camp through their church, offered to sponsor Margaret. Buck's family ranch agreed to employ Greta, teaching her ranch management in exchange for her translation skills with the increasing number of Mexican workers they employed. The 41 women who chose repatriation left in June. There were tears at their departure, but also understanding. Some people needed to return home, no matter what they would find there. They carried with them letters from American soldiers to German civilians, small gestures of reconciliation in a shattered land. 20 years later, Greta Callahan stood in the same mess hall, now restored to its original purpose as the ranch's dining room. She had married Buck 5 years after the war ended, a union that scandalized some but surprised no one who knew them. They had built a life together on the land that had once been her prison. She was hosting a reunion. Anna had returned from Germany, where she had been working with war orphans. Marguerite came from California, where she taught German at a university. Others who had been at that first Thanksgiving dinner gathered around tables once again. "That meal changed everything," Anna said quietly. "It was the first time someone looked at us and saw people instead of enemies." Greta smiled, remembering the terror and hope of that day. one impossible invitation, one shared meal, one moment when enemies chose to see each other as human beings. Sometimes, that was all it took to change a life.